Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is now in Germany for the fifth round of China-Germany intergovernmental consultations and an official visit. The two sides are expected to deepen cooperation on artificial intelligence and autonomous driving. Before his arrival in Berlin, Li paid an official visit to Bulgaria and attended the 7th leaders meeting of China and 16 Central and Eastern European countries in Sofia, a mechanism otherwise known as 16+1. The Chinese Premier's visit comes at a time when U.S. President Donald Trump slapped tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese exports and threatened to impose a 20% import tariff on all EU-assembled vehicles, raising the risk of a lengthy global trade war. So what could be the fallout from Trump's trade tariffs on European businesses? And how can China and the EU potentially work together to defend the free trade and multilateral trading regime? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Joining me today for the discussion from Brussels is Duncan Freeman, a research fellow at the EU-China Research Center in the College of Europe, and in the Beijing studio, Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and Einar Tangen, Political and Economic Affairs commentator. But before we start our discussion today, here is my take on the subject: why is China determined to win President Trump's economic world war? So, the Trump administration has launched the largest trade war in its history against China. For the latter, this is a war it is determined to win. First, let's make this clear. China has no choice but to fight back. Have you seen what happens to the poor kids who are bullied on the school playground? The more they recoil, the more they are taken advantage of. An ancient Chinese saying goes, stop the use of force with weapons, stop a war with fighting. In the eyes of the Chinese government and the Chinese people, trade is negotiable, but bullying is not. But China didn't fight back until it was unavoidable. Facing the Trump team's maximum pressure, the Chinese government has exercised maximum restraint. Since things heated up this spring, China remained calm, issued warnings, remained open to talks, to reasonable demands, and refrained from firing the first shot. But all of this fell on deaf ears. Only 3 rounds of negotiations were held between these two sides. Although China maintained that it was open to talks, President Trump resorted to unilateral measures. It was clear they were not interested in resolving the issue through talks. Now, the trade war is unfortunately on, and China is determined to win. How so? For China, the Sino-US trade war is not about trade. It's about the future of the nation. It's clear that President Trump's real target is China's top-down approach to upgrade its industry and its economy. The Chinese people have the right to develop their economy and nation through legal and legitimate means. If Chinese companies or practices are not in line with foreign laws when they go abroad, foreign governments can do what is necessary, but to deprive Chinese companies of their right to grow, that is not reasonable. It's also something nobody can stop unless the Chinese people lose their collective purpose. Secondly, China is not fighting alone. This is an economic world war that the U.S. has launched against its allies, rivals, and other economies. The EU, Japan, Canada, South Korea, Mexico, India, Russia, Turkey, and China. They might have different political interests, but in terms of economics and trade, they share the same belief that the U.S. policy is against established international rules and the U.S.'s own undertakings in the past. America's tariffs on steel and aluminum, as well as its ongoing investigations into national security risks posed by imported cars, have been drawing criticism from economies around the world under the framework of the World Trade Organization. 7 economies, including the EU, Norway, Mexico, Canada, India, China, and Russia, have lodged formal complaints against the U.S. within the WTO. Total retaliatory tariffs against U.S. imports could reach $3.7 billion. The Sino-US trade war is not a war between 2 economies, but part of a global war between multilateralism and unilateralism. Thirdly, the Sino-US trade war is not just a war about trade, but a comprehensive assault on China's fundamental systems. The U.S. wants to pressure China to abandon its socialist path of development, where the state plays an important part in the economic and social development of the country. As a result, China could suffer some economic losses, but will not abandon its tools, which have proven effective after 40 years of reform and opening up. The Chinese systems and the Chinese people have been contributing to 1/3 of world economic growth since 2002 and continue to do so. The Chinese government and people are determined to win this battle, however long and hard the struggle will be, even if that might result in a long-term headwind to its development. In addition, the door of China's opening up will not close. It will open wider because it is in the interests of China to do so. China is doing its best to provide a more friendly environment for foreign businesses. We still have a long way to go, but have confidence in us. Patience pays. And now, let's start our discussion on what China and Europe could potentially do together facing the trade tariffs and unilateralism by the United States. And many thanks to all of my guests for joining me today, including Mr. Duncan Freeman joining us from Brussels. Let me go to Mr. Freeman in Brussels first. Mr. Freeman, what is the situation of the kind of trade tariff between the United States and EU at this particular moment? What kind of impacts is that already having, if any, on EU businesses?
Well, so far the direct impact has been quite limited. I think, however, what it really does at the moment is raise questions that there are no clear answers to about how the EU and the US find a way out of a trade dispute which really has arisen primarily because of United States efforts to, as it sees it, redress imbalances in trade between the EU and the US by imposing tariffs, but without any clear end game in sight. Although we have had statements, particularly in the case of cars, from Angela Merkel saying that she is willing to consider removing tariffs on American cars coming into Europe, but still whether that would be acceptable to other member states is an open question, and whether it would be acceptable, for instance, at the European level is also an open question. So at the moment the direct impact is limited, but there are serious concerns, and there's no clear and obvious way to get out of the current impasse as far as the tariffs are concerned.
How do we get into this situation, however, at this particular moment? We are seeing the United States, an ally to the EU, locked in trade frictions with the EU and the United States in a full-blown trade war against China. How come we're having this triangle at this moment, Mr. Freeman?
Well, obviously this has got a long history, perhaps going back many years of trade imbalances or economic imbalances between the European Union, China and the US, a system which has been primarily created in the West, particularly by the United States, but with a current administration in the United States which has decided that the system as it sees it is no longer working to the benefit of the United States. And Donald Trump was elected on a platform of redressing these imbalances and putting America first, and this is what essentially he is doing. He is taking a very unilateral approach to addressing these problems, and a very direct and perhaps simple approach through the use of imposition of import tariffs on imports coming from countries which are perceived to be treating the United States unfairly. So meaning particularly China, but also the European Union, which ostensibly is, yes, an ally of the United States.
Well, let's come back to my two guests here in the studio, Victor and Einar. Do you find it peculiar that the United States is at a trade, I wouldn't say a trade war with the EU, but at such a tension with the EU, its ally, and at China at the same time, Victor?
Well, I think one big megatrend today in the world is that the United States want to put itself above the WTO and want to build its own interest at the cost and at the expense of all the other major trading partners of the United States. And this is in complete violation of the WTO rules. This is in complete violation of the United States international commitments. And I don't think any country which is a counterparty to the United States will tolerate what President Donald Trump is doing. Trump is doing the wrong thing, and eventually it will cost a lot to the American economy as well as the American consumers, and this kind of trade protectionism is not sustainable. And it is very interesting that so many countries are rising up almost in tandem against what the United States is doing, and this shows that the big struggle we are faced with is whether we want to protect WTO principles or whether, in the case of the United States, they want to trample the principles of the WTO.
Einar, how do you look at the impact of the trade war between China and the United States on European countries, on European economies, European businesses?
Well, there's this kind of add-on effect that happens because there's so many Europeans that are assembling things here, and they're being affected by this. Any kind of tariff on Chinese goods could easily be a carry-on. But there's also a bright side for the EU, because quite frankly, the United States' biggest competitor is in fact the EU. They make everything that the US does. If you want a plane, if you want medical equipment, high technology, not necessarily chips as much. But if this continues, China will have no choice but to go to the EU, and the EU, which is not paying these tariffs, their goods will be more competitive, so they'll have a bigger, larger worldwide market. So this could exacerbate the problems that Donald Trump says he's trying to fix, which is trying to make America more competitive and bring jobs home. It's not going to happen.
We're going to take a very short break, and you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. We have been talking about China and Europe's response to U.S. trade unilateralism. And let me go to my guest in Brussels, Duncan Freeman. Mr. Freeman, if you could explain to us, how does the EU want to resolve the trade dispute with the United States, and whether you have observed any difference between that approach and China's approach towards the trade friction with the United States?
Well, in some ways, I think that the approaches of the EU and China have been quite similar. The EU obviously, first of all, tried negotiating with the US, particularly in the case of the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminium, looking for an exemption from those tariffs, which it didn't get. It's gone to the WTO, seeking redress through the WTO, which China has also done. And this has been the two key approaches that so far the European Union has adopted. However, this has not worked, and it's not clear exactly in the long term how we then get out of this impasse. Will it be through negotiation? Will it be through the WTO? That is a possibility, but at the moment it looks like the United States, even in the WTO, is not necessarily willing to subscribe to the global system of governance for trade. So it's still really at an early stage, I think. This is not going to be resolved in a short time. It's going to be quite a long trade war, if you want to call it a trade war, with at the moment no clear resolution in sight.
China has been calling on countries or economies in the world to join China in safeguarding the multilateral trading regime. What kind of potential cooperation do you think China and EU countries can have in terms of exactly that?
Well, I think in principle you could argue that China and the EU are essentially arguing for the same things, that the global system of governance of trade, which has been constructed over many years, should be respected and should be sustained. However, I think from the European point of view, there is still a degree of reservation about cooperation with China when the European Union, from its point of view, also has difficulties with the positions of China and the policies of China in a number of areas. So while in principle it might look like China and the European Union have similar positions, there is still here in Brussels a considerable amount of reservation about joining an alliance with China against the United States, which we must remember still from the point of view of Brussels is seen as Europe's ally rather than an enemy, although this is being put into question by Donald Trump at the moment in trade and also in security areas as well.
So very interesting point Mr. Freeman has brought up, the kind of dilemma that European economies is faced with at this moment, whether to align with China to counter US unilateralism together, or to stand by their traditional ally and pursue the kind of complaints that the United States is also complaining about. Victor, how do you look at this attitude of the EU at this moment?
Well, indeed, between EU and China there are many differences. However, whatever differences there are between EU and China, we are faced with a common struggle. That is, whether the WTO rules and principles and whether the international trading system that we have all become accustomed to should be protected or not. Because if the WTO system is wrecked, all of us will become victims, including, ironically, the United States. And therefore, I think, despite of all the differences between China and EU, the European countries should really wake up to the harsh reality that now it is time for all the countries to unite together against this kind of unilateralism, against this kind of blatant violation of the WTO rules, against this kind of attempt to put one country on top of all the other countries. And no country in the world should allow any other country to get away with this kind of unilateralism and violating the interests of all the other countries. And I think some people have called what President Donald Trump has been doing as trade terrorism. And I don't think that's exaggeration. That's exactly what the United States government under President Donald Trump is doing. And we need to get united against this kind of trade terrorism.
So basically what the European countries are faced with is slight sympathy with the aspirations behind, the motivation of President Trump, but not the means that President Trump has adopted. But can you sit on the wall and watch what happens next and decide?
The EU has to wake up to the fact that Donald Trump is not just making an assault on China. This is an assault against every multilateral institution. He said on the campaign trail his desire was to pull the United States out of every kind of multilateral agreement that they had, and he's doing it systematically. When the EU realizes, and I think they will get a very sharp shock when he attends the NATO conference and then hams it up for his next meeting with Putin, that he is not dedicated to a multilateral world. He's dedicated to a world where he says, look, America is strong now. They have the economics, the politics, and the military. If we do not press our advantage now, in 10 years we'll be too weak. And this is what Navarro and Bannon and all the rest of the four horsemen of the apocalypse are pushing. So I think he believes this. The question is, how much blowback is there going to be? Now, in terms of China, it's very simple. It's not, everyone keeps talking about the WTO. It has nothing to do with the WTO. He's trying to push China out of the global supply chain. Right now, if you look at almost any global supply chain, some parts of it run through China. In essence, China has become the center of this kind of manufacturing and all sorts of things. So he wants to stop that. That's why the $34 billion in tariffs that he's imposed so far and the 16 he's proposed all attack pieces of business, capital goods, intermediary goods. These are the things that American companies, ironically, need to complete products for sale. So he's going to take the cost up and force them to find other alternatives.
Well, if China and European countries do not realize the importance to act together, what could happen if China is indeed pushed out of this global value chain? Can the Europeans be safe on their own?
No, I don't think so. I think if President Donald Trump prevails and get away with this, which I don't think he will be able to do that, because trade war is always mutually destructive. But if he gets away, then Chinese economy will be wrecked. European economy will slow down significantly, because Europe has its own problem right now, in addition to whatever the trade war originating from the United States is causing. And then we will face a global recession. And I think millions of jobs will be lost in many parts of the world. And before anyone realizes, I think we will be in a very, very dangerous economic recession. And the economic recession is not just an economic recession, because in previous cases, economic recessions in many cases lead to war. So this is really a moment for all of us, for mankind, to pause and reflect, not only about trade war, but also war and peace. And we need to stop President Donald Trump in really taking such dangerous actions which may eventually bring about a global war.
I want to ask my guest in Brussels, Mr. Freeman, do you think President Trump should be stopped? Can he be stopped by countries individually? Do you think so? Or do Europeans think so?
I think it would be very difficult for countries individually to stop the policies of the President of the United States, and certainly he has shown no sign at all that he is particularly influenced by either China or the European Union or members of the European Union. It should be remembered that a number of European leaders have pressed Donald Trump to change policy on a number of issues and have completely failed. So I think, yes, there has to be some kind of consensus which is constructed over what is the nature of the global economy which we want to have. The idea of the Trump administration, or certainly some parts of the Trump administration, that we can somehow return to a pre-globalized national economy world where everybody is manufacturing their own goods for their own domestic markets, simply is not workable. The shift of the global supply chains, say from China, will not go back to the United States. They will go to other parts of the world. And so, you know, this is going to be the reality that the United States or these policies are going to face. So, yes, it's going to be a global consensus that's going to have to be reached over what exactly is the nature of the global economy we want to have.
Meanwhile, let's take a look at the kind of opportunities that if China and Europe deepen their cooperation, what kind of opportunity is potentially there. Let's listen to what Premier Li Keqiang said while visiting Bulgaria this time. He talked about the great potential between the two sides.
In the first 5 months this year, the trade between our two sides rose by 24.5%. It shows that there is great potential for cooperation between us, because China believes in multilateralism and global multipolarism.
Right, so a very important statement he makes, and also it's important that he made it at the 16+1 platform, which is a platform between China and Eastern and Central European countries. So there is one issue that is also bugging the European leaders a little bit, which is China's closer relationship, or close relationship with part of Europe. Victor, how do you look at this kind of the position of China in terms of its relationship with part of the EU and its relationship with the EU as a whole?
Well, indeed, in Brussels, there are sometimes misgivings about what China is really up to when it engages with the 16 Central and Eastern European countries, whether it's an attempt to split EU, for example. However, the reality is that the 16 Eastern and Central European countries do have their own unique circumstances, and their legitimate needs for economic growth have not been fully satisfied by the current EU system. This creates a very natural tendency for China and 16 Central and Eastern European countries to close their cooperation more and more in order for the Eastern and Central European countries to gain more momentum for economic development. And I think Brussels and EU as a whole should not be overly alarmed by China's so-called geopolitical attempt to split EU. The more united EU is, the better it is for China. And I think China cares more about economic growth of the EU region as a whole, but also about the 16 Eastern and Central European countries in particular. Hopefully, whatever China is doing will contribute to the overall growth of EU.
Yeah, China has expressed explicitly that China supports the unity of the European Union, and this time again Premier Li Keqiang said the same thing. A very important meeting coming up concerning NATO in just a couple of days. Einar, do you think this meeting is going to have some kind of bearing on the trade relationship between US and EU?
Well, it depends if it goes as expected. Donald Trump is, as I said, he's going to try to show that he's very independent. He's meeting with Putin thereafter. There's a lot of concerns on both sides about what's going to happen at that meeting. He's already gone out and said that he wants to bring all his troops back and take all his money. But I think what we need to look at here is the barbarian is at the gate. There's no point trying to talk to him. What it is necessary...
Or expect him to change, to be someone else.
He's not going to listen. He's dedicated to this. So the issue is, how can China and the EU work together? They don't have to form a grand alliance. All they need to do is to coordinate their economic responses directly to the same areas so that they're hitting Trump where it hurts.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests here in the studio. Victor Gao, Vice President at the Center for China and Globalization, and Einar Tangen, Political and Economic Affairs Commentator. And from Brussels, Duncan Freeman, a Research Fellow at the EU-China Research Center in the College of Europe. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.